Hi everyone, it's time for another live stream. Thank you so much for tuning in tonight, here in Sweden at least, and talk about Sergers, one of my favorite sewing machines, something I was a bit scared of in the beginning, but now I do love this machine. So I figured I should dedicate a live stream to talk about this one, because I'm sure you have a lot of questions, opinions, and all those things about this fast, powerful, and sometimes dangerous machine. So I would love to hear from you in the chat. Please say hi, and hopefully everything works out with the sound and all that stuff. And what I would like to know and hear from you is that I think for a lot of people that actually might watch this video, they are also on the fence of actually buying a Serger. So what I am really curious to hear from those of you who are watching now is what made you decide to buy a Serger? Please share that in the live chat so we can get some ideas if some of the people watching are on the fence whether or not it's worth investing in this machine, because it can be quite pricey, and I'm sure some people, at least I did before I got one, ask myself, is it really worth it when I can do a lot of the same things with a regular sewing machine? So I'm just going to say hi to a few people in the chat now. Hi Marina, hi Greg, hi Elizabeth, hi Rode, and hi Carol. I'm sorry I pronounced all the names wrong, I'm really sorry. Hi Subu and May Schumanns. So we have people from a lot of different countries here, from the Netherlands, from Canada. It's so nice to hear where you're from. Please tell me in the chat, because it's really lovely to hear. And Natasha has already spoken up about the question that I asked, if you're a Serger owner, what made you decide to buy one? And Natasha says Serger is 100% worth it if you're sewing with knits, and that is something I definitely agree upon, and I will talk about just in a bit what made me decide to buy a Serger. And we also have something from Nicaragua. I love this having this international crowd participating in this. It's so much fun. And Greg says Serger just gives so much more professional finish, and I couldn't agree more. That it's definitely one of the selling points as well for me. And Marina said, I bought one because I felt that my garments were never as well finished as the store-bought ones. Yeah, because the reality is that if you look inside a garment that is store-bought, unless it's, shall I say, haute couture or tailoring, most of the garments will at some point have passed the Serger or overlocker, as we say in some countries. In Sweden also we say overlock, so I'm using the American way of saying Serger, but I would love to know what different word you call this, because I know that overlock or overlocker is a pretty common way to describe this machine, even in English-speaking countries, but in Sweden it's overlock. And also Leslie says, I love my Serger for knits. Yeah, that is definitely a very strong reason to buy one. And I will tell the reason why I ended up buying one. I bought my first Serger, I think it was in 2004, because I'm getting a bit older. So I tried to remember if it was 2003 or 2004, but I think it was 2004. I'd probably say it wrong. At that point, I was part of a weekly sewing circle with a couple of other sewists, and one of them had a Pfaff Serger cover stitch combo machine, and I've been sewing knits since the 80s, and I began sewing knits using my mother's very old Singer, and that, to be honest, wasn't a very good machine for sewing knits, but I then sort of upgraded to obviously also vintage, but a great machine, the Husqvarna or Viking 2000, which has a lot of stretches, even though the machine was made in the late 60s, early 70s. And when I switched that, my result that did improve. But what happened was that when I then saw the knit tops that this woman was sewing with her Pfaff Serger cover stitch machine, I was like, oh my god, I was so blown away, because, you know, all the finishing, everything looked absolutely store-bought, and that was definitely something I I was striving to sort of achieve for the next level, because I've already been sewing for over 20 years. But I was so taken by how well her garments looked. So I decided to do the same thing, but unfortunately I was definitely not very I had basically not very much money, to be honest, back then, so I wasn't able to buy the same machine that she had. So I bought the how shall I call it, the budget version of that same machine. It's from the brand Pfaff. I think they used to do quite good machines, but you know, this one was definitely very plastic, and also a combo machine, obviously. And though it did its job, it did its job, and it lasted for let me see here, it broke down in 2016, I think. So it lasted for 12 years. Was it? Yeah, 12 or 13 years. It served me. It didn't serve me well, but I was able to do a lot of knits with it, and obviously I was also able to use the cover stitch function. And then I decided to retire it after the cover stitch broke down, and instead I invested in this one, which is very much more expensive. It probably costs twice as much as that Serger cover stitch machine that I bought in the early 2000s. This one is Imagine from Overlock. I've done a separate video about that, so if you haven't already, you can check that out and see my opinions about that and whether or not it's worth this much money. So that is my Serger story. And now I'm going to see some questions in the chat here. And Duvsugal, she sort of has similar thoughts than I did. And when I was young, I didn't care about that, you know, the finishing. But now I want my garments to look professional. I want the inside to look professional as well. And that's something, you know, a development I think a lot of us go through when we become more experienced with this skill. And Elizabeth brings us another great point about why the Serger is such a great machine. It's so fast, especially if you compare that with sewing stretch stitches on a sewing machine, because that goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So just stitching one side seam on the top can feel like forever. Whereas with this one, it's like pedal to the metal and you're boom, and you on to the next project, which is also a great thing, because sometimes, you know, sitting, you know, in front of the sewing machine, you know, going back and forth, it's not all that exciting, if you agree with me. And Natasha, she has the same, she used to have the same machine, and I did. The Pfaff cover style is cursed. I bought the same machine for the same reasons. Well, I feel your pain. And actually, I think they retired that machine quite quickly. That was not meant for the long run. And as I said, mine eventually even broke down, which I don't think is that common, but that was the quality of that one. And we have more people from the chat here. From USA, Ohio, and Minnesota. And Susie says, what do you think about a 3-spool serger? I have no experience with a 3-spool serger, but if anyone in the chat has it, I will love to know. So please share your experience and I will read that up. Mine is a 4-spool serger, and obviously the combination machines, they have 5 spools or up to 8 spools of thread. So the 3 thread I think is more unusual. Obviously that means you also the range of stitches must be limited, right? Because you can't do all the 4 thread ones that you're able to do with a 4-spool serger. And Carol says, I'm so happy I finally bought a serger after many years of thinking it wasn't necessary. It's a game changer, especially for knits. 100% agree. And Trudy gives a shout out to the Husqvarna Viking. For 17 years, it's still going strong. I love it. Yeah, I love it too. I actually just got rid of it because I wanted to upgrade to a computerized machine, but I still use an old one. It's a Bernina 1230, I think, 1230, if you say that right. It's from the late 80s, so it's still an old machine, but not as old as the Viking. And Natasha gives some explanation about the 3-spool here. It will do a marrow style stitch and a roll hem. They're used for finishing, but not for the structure of seams. Well, they do seem a bit limited. I can imagine that in the garment industry, that makes a lot of sense, having a 3-spool machine, because then you have just, I mean, usually in the garment industry, they have dedicated machines for all types of finishing. So there's not really a problem if you just want to do that type of stitches. But for us home sewists, having a larger range of stitches is something that I find really valuable, and that's what I'm going to talk about now, because I prepared a little bit of a slide to show you at least some of the stitches that you can do with the serger, and talk a little bit about the ones I use and a bit more. So I'm going to switch to that one now. So when you're sewing with knits, you usually have two different options to choose from when it comes to side seams. I'm a big fan of the 3-thread overlock, which only uses one needle, and you can do that as a narrow and you can do that as a wide. It's not as durable, I would argue, than the 2-needle 4-thread overlock, but it has fantastic amount of stretch, so it's really good for that purpose. And also the 3-thread overlock is fantastic for finishing overcasting. So basically, if you, I'm going to see if I got some jeans to show you because I'm working on jeans now, and I'm using my serger for that as well. So I actually, if you can see this, I overcast my denim with the 3-thread overlock as well. So this is probably my most used stitch, and I also use it when I'm making blouses and pretty much all type of wovens. I use either this or the flat lock seam, but I'm now loving this one more than the flat lock seam, actually, because there are some values about using this, because I think it's even more durable than the flat lock seam. And another common stitch that, especially if you're sewing with knits, is the 4-thread overlock. It's basically the standard, I think, stitch for sewing knits. It uses two looper threads and 2 needle threads, and it is very, very durable, a little less elastic and a little more bulky than the 3-thread overlock, which is that why I don't use it for all type of knits. But if you're sewing with more stable knits that aren't supposed to stretch out as much, this is probably the better choice, in my opinion at least. But you know, there are lots of opinions on that. And another nice stitch to have on the serger is the flat lock stitch, and there are 2 different versions. The one that I show you now in the photo is a 2-thread, which is a nice, when you pull it apart, you will see on the front there's a nice looping shape, and on the back there's a ladder. And this one is actually, it's a picture from my book Sewing Activewear, where I describe how you can actually use the flat lock seam, the 2-thread flat lock seam, for hemming. So if you look close on the picture, you can see that the ladder stitch on the bind is actually just keeping the folded piece of hem in place. So if you want to achieve a similar look to some more professional, you can actually use the 2-thread flat lock for hemming as well. You just need to disengage the knife. But in my book Sewing Activewear, I describe that method in detail, step by step. And here is the 3-thread flat lock seam. This one is actually a bit harder to get to lie flat, and the trick is to use, if you have a serger which you can adjust the tension, which I don't anymore, you need to usually increase the needle tension and decrease, no, sorry, you need to increase the loop tension and decrease the needle tension. And also you can see here I have a sort of a fluffy thread, and this is woolen nylon, and that also helps increase the tension of the looper. So if you're doing a flat lock, having a woolen nylon in the looper, which will usually help to make the flat looks a bit more flat when you pull the part. But the 3-thread is more harder to get to lie flat than the 2-thread. And another nice thing about the serger is that you can also do roll hem. So if you look closely on this photo of a dress that I've made, this is the sleeves are super willowy and absolutely impossible to hem with in a nice way apart from using the roll hem. And so that is a really nice thing to have, especially if you're sewing with very wavy knits and stretches out, or if you're doing some type of bat wing sleeve, or hemming a skirt or something else that has a lot of volume and really needs a narrow hem. This is much more easy to achieve than using a roll hem on your sewing machine. Of course, you can hand stitch as well. And if you have a combination machine that has 5 threads or more, you can usually have more options for the stitch. And this one is, I had on my last machine, it's called a 3-thread super stretch. This is really, really good when you're making activewear, but it is not available on a regular serger. But what it does is it has one looper thread and 2 needles, so it has both the best worlds, I think. I love this stitch, but unfortunately it's not on my current serger. And another thing you will get if you buy a combination machine is the safety stitch or the security stitch, which basically both so a straight seam or a chain stitch to be exact, and overcast at the same time. So in the garment industry, this is a very, very common finish when you look inside garments. So they actually do 2 things at the same time. So that is obviously a good way to save a lot of time. That said, sometimes a chain stitch is not as durable as a regular straight stitch on your sewing machine. So it can be a bit pros and cons, but it's definitely something that you can use and have a bonus if you invest in a combination machine, which I don't have anymore for reasons I explained earlier. But there are good combination machines as well. The very pricey Overlock Ovation, I think it's called, is a combination machine that it's getting rave reviews and doesn't really need a lot of changes when you're setting up it, switching between serger and cover stitching. And Jessica from Sweden, hello, it's nice to hear from a fellow Swedish. She says, hello from a fellow seamstress in Sweden. I would love a tutorial on how to make a small rolled hem on a serger. I will definitely do that. I've got some requests on that before, and there are some tricks you need to know, especially you might need to experiment with the stitch length in order to get the finish right. So it's not always straightforward. So I will definitely do a tutorial about that in the future. Thank you for the reminder, Jessica. And Linda says, hi, I have a brother 1034D. What would be a good upgrade? That I would love if someone in the chat told me, because I only have 2 experience. One awful surgery that I strongly advise against, and this one, the Imagine, that was very expensive, a bit too expensive I think, but it's also a really good surgery. So, but I think I've heard that Yuki brand and I think also Janome makes good sergers, and of course Overlock, but I do think that the price range is a bit higher on most Overlock serger, if I'm not mistaken. I also know that some people like the Bernina sergers, but since I don't have much experience, I feel hesitant to recommend certain models. So no one will be upset with me if I give some wrong recommendations here. So I'm a little bit careful about giving recommendations. And anyways, that was about stitches, which is like the basic things that you need to know about the serger. And what else can a serger do? I think there are also a couple of more ways you can use the serger as well. You can use it for blind hem stitches, just like you do on a regular sewing machine. But do be aware that when you're using a regular serger for blind hemming, you will get like tiny ladders, just like on the flat lock seam, on the outside of the fabric. So the ones that you see in store-made, store-bought garments that has blind stitch on a machine, that is actually done on a dedicated blind stitch machine, and that finishing is much nicer. But if you are using a thread that matches the color of the fabric, or using one of those transparent threads, I think you can achieve a pretty good result with the serger as well. I do think it comes down to practice. I still prefer the combination. I actually, when I do blind hem, which I do quite a lot on knits even, is that I first overcast on the serger, usually using the flat lock, the 2-thread flat lock, or now the 3-thread flat lock, because the good thing about a serger is the differential feed, I will talk about in a second, is that it keeps the fabric from growing, right? And then I just press it inside, and then I switch to my sewing machine and use my blind hem presser foot and do the blind hemming that way. So if you're sewing any type of more stable knit, and of course woven, this is a fantastic way to get a really nice finishing using a blind hem stitch on your machine and a combination with the serger. I've done several tutorials about that, so you can go over to my blog and check that out, how I do that both on woven and on knit fabric. So that's a good tip. And we have some recommendation now for brands. Elizabeth says, I love my Yuki. And Kelly says, I bought a used Janome that has been great. And we have another fellow Swedish Thursday from Säterdalen. Finally found the shed, Kiki here. Hi, Kiki. And we have Susanne from Sävedalen. That's very close to where I live. Excellent. So it's nice to have so many Swedish people tonight. That's not as common. I love that because, you know, we do have a quite vital Swedish sewing community as well, even though it perhaps isn't as famous, so to speak, than some of the sewing communities in America or in the UK, for instance. But we have a very vital thing going on here in Sweden as well. Anyways, that was about stitches, and what I want to talk now about a bit is about the settings, because that's something that is also really important to understand, and I'm sure a lot of you already know all this, but in case you're thinking about getting a serger or have some troubles, I think it's good to go through the settings anyways. And I think one of the biggest selling points with the serger is this. Is the differential feed. It looks a bit different on different machines. This one has a lever that goes back and forth. Usually there's a knob that you move around, and usually normal will work very fine on most fabrics. And what does the differential feed does? Well, it regulates how the feed dogs move in relation to each other. So if you increase the differential feed, a higher number, this will keep the fabric, it will pull it together like this, right? Because when you're sewing on a regular sewing machine, especially when you're sewing with knits or like thin fabrics cut on bias, you know how the sewing machine loves to stretch that out, and sometimes the wavy effect is desirable and sometimes it's not, and the differential feed is a fantastic way to regulate that. So if you have a problem with the fabric growing, increase the differential feed, and if you have the opposite problem, that the fabric is you get puckers and it pulls together too much, you just lower the differential feed. I find that normal works really well for most projects, both woven and knits, but I think some machines it's a little bit different. On the Overlock this was definitely the case, but I found on my old Fuff I usually had to increase the differential feed when I was sewing with knits. So that's really good to know, and you can use that to your advantage if you want to create, for instance, you can also use your serger to create gathers. So then you increase if you want to create gathers, you increase the differential feed, and if your serger has tension, which most have, not mine, regulation tension, you just increase the tension on the needle. So, and combining an increased differential feed and this will create wonderful gathers. For instance, if you want to add a gather detail on a garment, if you want to set in sleeves, if you want to create puff sleeves, all these things, I would say of all the methods I've tried, and I've tried everyone, trust me, this is my favorite way to create gathers on a garment. And they're also very movable, so because you can just pull the threads in to regulate how much the fabrics gather. So that's definitely one of the things I highly recommend that you try if you haven't already, because also when you're doing gathers on a regular sewing machine, at least I still struggle getting, even gathers, but this one, it creates even gathers. I love it. So that's really, really good to know about the differential feed. I would love to hear your thoughts about that as well. And another thing that all Sergers has is the cutting width. Basically, that means how far the knife will be from the edge. So obviously, if you're stitching a wider stitch like the wide overlock, then of course you will have to have a wider cutting width, and if you do something more narrow, you need to decrease this. And of course, as I talked about when I do a flat lock hem, you can also disengage the knife for doing certain things as well, so you don't have to cut things. Another trick that I was taught when I took a class for the baby lock is that I've noticed on the baby lock in particular, sometimes my stitching got a little bit bubbly. I don't know if that's the right word, slightly, not wavy as in stretched out, but sort of uneven. And when I used the recommended setting, which was the max cutting width for when doing a wide stitch, and the teacher said to actually, which felt unintuitive, is that the right word for me, but actually to decrease the cutting width, and that helped. It sounds so stupid because I thought that the area was too tight, and that was the reason why. So I definitely recommend you do a sample depending on your fabric, especially when sewing with knits, to see that you find the ideal cutting width. And I would love if you have more experience about this, because that is not really, sometimes I wouldn't say I'm a Serger expert, if that makes sense. So I would love to get your ideas as well on how to use the cutting width or the knife cutting width to the best abilities. And a second thing, of course, is the stitch length. And I get confused by that word, especially perhaps because I'm Swedish, but it more regulates the density of the stitch, how evenly they are spaced or not. So of course, if you increase the stitch length, there will be more space between each loop, and if you decrease it, I usually find that somewhere in the middle of the recommendation setting is usually best. I very, very seldom go to the lowest stitch length, because I find that it doesn't feed the fabric well, and it doesn't look as good either when it's too dense. But that's just my experience. I'm sure that it has some uses as well, but I'm not a huge fan. So that's definitely something that I think is worth experimenting with as well. And of course, tension, usually every Serger will come with recommended tension settings, but you will definitely need to experiment with that depending on the thickness of the fabric, depending on if you're wanting to achieve certain styles. And so I would definitely go out and try different things. And also, if you, as I said, depending on what thread you use, if you're using woolen nylon, which is this fluffy thread that I'm holding here, then this will automatically increase the tension in the looper. And this is what, if you look inside a lot of knit garments that you buy in stores, you will actually see that in the looper, it has a soft, fluffy, flossy thread, and this is woolen nylon. This will increase the tension, so you will usually have to decrease the tension on the tension settings, just because to balance that out. On this baby lock, it does work anyway, so it's good. It can help, but if you notice something wrong, that's usually mean you need to start experiment either by decreasing the looper tension or increasing the needle tension, because they work in tangent. I hope I say that right. So usually you can, if you have problems with stitching, you can usually try all the both things, because increasing the needle tension also can be the same thing accomplished by decreasing the looper tension. I hope that makes sense. I'm so sorry. It's a bit late here, so I'm probably a bit confusing. And Saturdawn also has a recommendation for the one questions about what type of cover stitch machine. Oh, sorry, Serger machine. She says, I have Janome Mylock 644D. Love it. So Janome looks like a safe bet on that. I have Janome as a cover stitch machine, so I'm definitely have respect for that brand. They make really sturdy machines. And yes, so that was a bit about the settings. Of course, another thing that I usually don't touch but could be worth investigating as well is the presser foot pressure. So if you are sewing over thick layers, you actually need to increase the presser foot pressure, so you just pull it down like this. And if you are sewing over lightweight fabrics, you might have to decrease the presser foot pressure, sorry. Hope that makes sense. And you need to experiment with that, but I usually find on the Serger it's not much of a problem. It usually works well. On the cover stitch machine, however, I find myself often having to alter the presser foot pressure depending on the fabric that I'm sewing. It all depends on the machine. And another vote for Yuki says Ater. Yuki is sturdy and great. So we have two brands now that sticks out, Yuki and Janome, and of course the baby lock, as I've been talking about. But as I said, it's a different price range, so it's not for everyone for sure. I just wish it was. I just wish you could. Probably, actually, maybe it's a bit overpriced. I mean, it's a great machine, but I think it's a little bit overpriced, to be honest. what else is on my list? Yeah, other things you need to consider is needles and threads, and I'm going to start just talking briefly about threads. These are regular Serger threads. They are a bit thinner than regular sewing machine thread, and they're also cross wound, which means that they release easily from the spool, which is one of the advantages of using thread on cones, right, instead of a regular sewing machine. But you can also use a regular sewing machine if you put on a spool cap here, because that will help the thread to release evenly. So you're not limited to using 30 thread. And as I talked, I'm a big fan of using wool and nylon. I'm two brands that has a good reputation. This one is yet to be tried by me, because I am doing an experiment later on this year, hopefully on the blog, where I'm going to test different brands of wool and nylon and see how they behave. But this one is Maxi-Lock stretch, and I've linked to this brand in the description section, so you can go and check that out. It seems universally loved as a wool nylon. And also this one, which I've yet to try, it's from Overlock. It's called Madeira. I love it. The color is so beautiful. And so this one I've tried, and it's really good. So these I can recommend. And also, you're not really limited to just using, you know, basic one color 30 thread. In fact, Maxi-Lock, which is the same brand as the stretch one, also makes this. Can you see this? It's actually has several different shades in it, so I'm dying to try this out in my Serger. So it is Serger thread, but it's decorative, so that's also a good option to explore if you want to be more adventurous with the thread. And when it comes to budget Sergers, we have a recommendation for Cecilia. She says, I got a Singer, it was really cheap, but definitely doing the job. So that's perhaps is a good budget alternative to check out if the budget is tight, which, well, all this stuff, they do cost a lot of money. that's a downside of sewing, and especially it's annoying when you really have to pay more money to get better quality, as I experienced with the FUF situation that I talked about earlier. So that is my primer on thread. And another thing that is also really important is that when you thread, you always need to put the presser foot up like this, because that will release the tension disc. So you don't thread or change thread until the presser foot is up, because that knows. And you also need to make sure, and you floss a little bit here to make sure that the thread is properly placed in the tension disc, because usually when these stitches look super weird and jumbled and messed up, that's usually because something is wrong with the tension. And usually it's because it's not properly placed inside the tension disc. You need to sort of rub it a little bit back and forth like this to make sure that it sits well. I'm also really curious if there's someone in the chat who is considering getting a Serger and want to have some feedback on that. So please tell me, and I will do my best, and the other people in the chat as well, to answer, pros and cons with the Serger. But as most of us who have bought a Serger, we are very happy about it, especially because it gives us professional finish, it's fast, and it improves the result, especially when sewing with knits. And Athir Abdullah has also a great question, which I think is basically two thoughts about this one. Do you change the color of thread, or don't I when it's not seen? A lot of people, I think, like to use blender thread for the looper thread, because that usually will not be visible on the outside. And blender thread, that's usually some kind of gray that blends well with the other threads. And that obviously saves a lot of time, because rethreading a Serger is not always fun. And but I'm a bit how should I say, obsessive about the details. It's not very healthy, I'll admit that, but I'm very sort of obsessed with having my thread to match the fabric. And if you look at the wall behind me, you can see I have a pretty large range of different Serger threads. And sometimes if I can't find a matching looper thread, I actually use regular sewing machine threads So the smart ones probably use blending threads for the looper, so you only need to switch the needle threads. And the more obsessive ones, that will be, I will be one of those, likes to change all the threads. So I would love to hear your thoughts about that. Are you a changer or are you a blender? So, but blender is definitely the ones that makes life easier, and I am one of those people who makes life more complicated. And we have someone from India as well. Hi Vinod Kalana, so nice to you. I think we have covered pretty much all over the world now. It's super fun. And what else about threads? Well, you can use also decorative threads. Something I have not really experimented a lot with, but for instance, if you're doing a rolled hem or a visible stitch, you can actually use thicker thread, flossy thread, embroidery thread in the looper, because that would create a really nice cover effect. And also if you're into like doing decorative seaming, using the sort of narrow stitching and things like that, using a decorative thread in the looper, in both usually, will create a really cool finishing. And which brings me to some book recommendation, because there are a lot of good things that we can talk about when it comes to Sergers. And one of my favorite Serger book is this one. It's called Serger Secrets, and it's definitely an inspiration now when I'm working on my cover stitch book that will be out in the beginning of next year, because this one is like a total Bible. It definitely has some years on it, but it really goes through everything, and it has some fantastic ideas on how to use a serger for decorative purposes as well, just really way beyond the stuff that I'm covering today. So if you're going to buy a book, I can recommend this one. There are several more ones that I like. One that I also like is called Sewing with Sergers. I've linked this book and the other book in the description section, so you can see what I mean. It's by Patty Palmer, the other book, which I don't have because I keep borrowing it from the library, but I'm going to buy it now. It's a really nice little nifty pocket books with fantastic, easy to understand illustration to go through all the basics that you really need to know about a serger. So if you're a beginner, I would actually recommend you get that one. You don't need know a book necessarily. In fact, I would argue that some of the older books are actually more extensive and helpful, but I would love to hear your recommendations as well, because I have not read all the Serger books and there are quite a few ones out there. So please tell in the chat now which is your favorite Serger book. So I do recommend having one, because this has taught me so many things. For instance, I had no idea that woolly nylon added tension until I read it in this book. So this book is full of little nuggets. The styles, well, they are a little bit dated, to be honest. They don't feel very current in some reasons, but in some instances. But there's so many cool ideas how to insert zipper using a serger, how to do bound buttonholes. Also, it has some chapters on cover stitching as well, not as much as one would have hoped, but some at least, and a lot of other cool ideas that you can use serger for. I had no idea until I bought this book. So please tell me if you have any more book recommendation. I will add those to the show notes and description for this. Another book, the name, another serger book I can recommend. The name sort of. I can't remember it hands-on, but it's a self-published book by a guy which covers a lot of the technical things about a serger, which I thought was really helpful as well. And I've linked it up in the description section. You can buy it as a Kindle book. It's really inexpensive, but really great resource when you want to know the mechanics behind and maintenance and troubleshooting and all this sort of stuff. It's not as focused on stitching, but more about the behind-the-scenes stuff that also is important to know when you have a serger. So it's really good complement to the other books. And Itch to Sew has a recommendation. I bought the crafty class of Angela Wolf. That helped me understand the serger, but I definitely think that having a serger demonstrator is really valuable, especially when you're starting out, because it's quite difficult to control, and it's hard sometimes, I think, learn that from a book perhaps. I was able to get classes for both my purchases, which helped a lot, but I still struggle, that's how it is. I have many serger horror stories, especially for the first few years, where especially when I was attaching the sleeve to the sleeve opening on knit garments, because you do that on a flat, right? And when I was stitching and came to the shoulder seam here, I had a tendency of sort of slipping and cutting right through the shoulder instead. So I have had a few garments where I had to just put some applique or decorative stitching here because I was sort of sliding with my surgery. And it happened last year, the last time, where I managed to cut through a zipper and a facing on an almost finished top. And that was, I've done a video when I talk about that. Oh, that was very, very unfortunate. I did mend it, so to speak. You can tell because I used some zigzag stitch over it, but that was not fun, cutting through a zipper and everything, because that was really, really hard to mend. So I do recommend that you're focused when you work on your serger, and remember that it's fast and it has sharp knives. So that's good to keep in mind. If you have any serger horror stories, please share in the chat here, because I'm sure we have a few of those, everyone. It's probably a rite of passage, you know, having those mishaps with the knife and the speed. And Barbara has some thoughts about the blender versus matching, and Barbara says, I tried to be a blender, but the obsession of matching took over. Yep, I can relate, Barbara. And Samsama Designer Boutique says, I have the Babylock Invasion. It's absolutely fantastic. I have heard no one complaining about that machine, and the only thing is that it's crazy expensive. It's like a decent used car in Sweden, at least. And here's another recommendation for a serger class, Sara Snuggerud. Definitely helped me getting over my fear of threading the serger. Yeah, because that's really important to thread the serger. If you don't get the threading right, everything else, well, it will be a mess. That's for sure. Yeah, I'm just going to mention a couple of other things that I sometimes get questions about. And of course, please chime in as well in the chat with your thoughts about this. One question I get sometimes is, how do you secure a serger thread? And the short answer is that usually I don't. Why, you may ask? Well, usually I will stitch over Serge. It's really getting really late now. Serge team with another Serge. So this will basically enclose everything, and so usually you don't really have to do it. But if you want to do it, the most common method is that you thread this tail that you have inside a big needle in the needle eye, and then you pull the chain here inside a few of the stitches, and you just attach it, just sewing a couple of stitches. This is probably the most common method. You can also try pulling the looper thread like this, because that will create a little bit of a knot. Now, of course, if you have 3 dark navy threads, it's absolutely impossible usually to see which one is the needle thread and which one is the looper thread. But that's also a way to just secure a little bit if you're a bit uncertain. I also think you can also use fray check, which is not really available in Sweden, I think, but I know it's very popular in North America. That's also a way of securing the thread here. So, but if you have any other ideas and your thoughts about securing the 30 thread, please tell me in the chat. And another thing that sometimes happens is that something went wrong and you want to remove the serger thread. And the good thing about the serger, again, which I think is a big selling point over the sewing machine overlock stitches, is that sewing machine overlock stitch is absolutely horrible to rip, because, as I said, it goes back and forth, creating a really durable seam that is absolutely dreadful to rip. But with the serger, it's a very durable seam, but the best way I find is that you pull the needle thread and that will release the looper threads. So you just need to locate that. And of course, when you have a big chain like this, that will be pretty impossible. But you can also look closely, especially if you have a magnifying device or sharp eyes. You can actually see on the stitch here which one is the needle thread, and then you just use a regular seam ripper, a needle, an awl, and just pull that out and then start pulling. And usually if you catch the right thread, you can remove that quite easily, and then you just lift away the looper thread. So it's actually quite easy to rip for the most part. And we have a couple of more blenders here. A couple of more changer here. Saturdalen says, I'm a changer of thread trying to be more of a blender. Well, I can feel you. And Sally said, hi Joanna, I always like to change all the threads. Do you change your needles for different fabric or is it no need? That's a great question because I forgot to talk about the needles. Sorry. The short answer is that compared to a cover stitch machine and a sewing machine, Sergers seems to be much more forgiving when it comes to not using the optimal needles. Would you agree with me? I have had used really old needles without any problems. I have sometimes used even the wrong type of needles. I don't recommend that, but you know, life happens. But for a lot of Sergers, not everyone, but a lot of them is the ELX system, the one that is recommended. You need to check your manual for that. This one is ELX. Schmetz is one brand that makes them. I know that Oregon, I think, or Oregon. I don't remember the name exactly. Does it well? There's a couple of different brands that use the ELX system, and that is a ballpoint needle made for Serger. So it has a little bit more of a ballpoint than a universal tip, but universal needles will also work on knits on Sergers, I've found, but it's important to pick the right needle system. And to answer your question, Sally, I usually keep the size, now I'm holding 90, but that's usually for my cover stitch machine. But normally I use size 80/12 for pretty much all my Serger needs, because it's very, very seldom that I need to switch 90. When I did switch to 90 for the denim fabric, but I think I could have gotten away with the 80s as well, because I don't know, if something about the Serger, it just pushes through the fabric in a manner that is just so much more powerful, if that's the word, compared to cover stitch or sewing machine. So my experience at least is that you don't need to be as meticulous about sizing and stuff when you're sewing with the serger. So that's a long answer of saying that no, I don't really change the needles a lot when I'm serging. Just make sure that I have the right one. And Greg says, I had a tech tell me to stick with sharp needles only even when sewing knits. Yeah, definitely. Most troubles, needle troubles, comes when you are sewing with knits, especially if you're sewing on a cover stitch or a regular sewing machine. But on woven fabrics, yeah, I don't know why, but it's you know, you can use really old needles. I wouldn't go on record here in the video to talk about exactly how old some of the needles I have had in the Serger, but let's just say they are way too old for the recommended duration, but they're still working fine. So now you know. So yeah, that was about needles. And another question that I get sometimes is how to serge when you have like sharp corners, perhaps 90-degree corners, because obviously that is not very easy. Here is how I have serged the fly of the jeans that I'm making. You can see here, it looks like this on the front. And so it's actually serged in one swoop all the way here. I am not a master of this, so the thread is actually a little bit outside in the sharpest corner here. But the trick is to, of course, make sure that you can try to make this line as straight as possible, either by doing like this, or, which is also described in the book Serger Secrets, where I talked about, you can also, that's super hard to show when I'm holding it, but you can sort of scrunch the fabric together to also create that straight line. So that is probably the best way of serging sharp corners. And of course, if you are serging really sharp corners like this, of course you just stop here and then you start serging this direction instead. So I don't think usually there's a need to serge outside corners, but the inside corners, that can cause a little bit of problem. But that you need to manipulate the fabric to make sure that the edge of the fabric get as close to the needle as possible. But it definitely takes some practice, and I don't feel I'm quite there yet, to be honest. So that is another tip to know about that. And let me see if you have any more questions. Please tell me now, because we are actually only about 10 minutes left now of the chat. So if you have any more questions or suggestions about topic covered, please tell me now so I can address them. And let me see, what else can I talk about? Yeah, also I got a question during another live stream if you are perhaps stitching on the round. There's basically two ways to finish the I mean, for instance, if you're attaching a waistband to a pair of leggings, for instance, you will stitch on the round, right, using a Serger's seam, and when you're beginning to overlap, there are two ways to finish the seam. Either the easy way is just to make like okay, now right and left, that is not my strength. I'm going to think a little here now. I think that means you should curve to the right, basically. So you stitch out like this. That will create, so you just stitch over for a couple of centimeters, a couple of inches, and then you just make a right turn. I hope I said this right. And you stitch out and leave a chain of thread. So that is the easiest way of doing that. But if you are a stickler for nice finishing, you can instead, again, overlap for a little bit, and then you, release the presser foot, which already released, and you release the threads, usually by moving the hand wheel, and then you pull the fabric out, and then the threads will follow, and then you cut it off. And that means you will have not that sort of curved finishing. So again, if you want that really nice finishing, I recommend you use the second method I described. But again, it's all about taste for sure. And we have someone from New Zealand as well. Hi, Michelle. Hi from New Zealand. Great video. Thank you so much. Lester Flores says, how to hem with the Sergers always been a challenge. Well, definitely. Hemming is definitely more tricky. Roll hem is not the most easy thing to master for sure. It also depends on the serger. I think this one is a little bit better. And also the flat lock hemming seam that I described is also requires some practice. So I wouldn't, when I'm buying a serger, I wouldn't perhaps primarily consider it to be a hemming tool. That I would recommend a cover stitch machine or a regular sewing machine, but it's definitely a way to hem tricky, stretchy, wavy fabrics to give it a really nice finish. And so there are definitely situations where a serger is preferably over a regular sewing machine. For instance, I have not yet, despite being sewing for over 30 years, managed to create a nice roll hem with the roll hem presser foot that is included in some sewing machines, because you know it just stretches out and it's wavy and the finish looks awful. Whereas, for instance, as I talked about the dress that I showed you here, which I did with the roll hem, as you can see, and this was actually even done on my old serger, which wasn't as good, and you can still see how nice the finishing is, I hope. So that is definitely a reason to have a serger as well if you sew a lot of soft drapey fabric. This is rayon, which is one of those fabrics that is very, and silk as well, obviously, is absolutely, this roll hem is absolutely perfect for that purpose. So what else? I do think I had a couple of other things to mention as well. Yeah. Usually when you buy a serger, it usually only includes one presser foot, which is a regular presser foot. But for instance, when I bought my baby lock, I got a deal, basically, which included about 5 or 6 other presser foots, including a blind end presser foot. Let me see if I find the right word. A binding. Am I right? Binding? Yeah. Binding presser foot, an elastic presser foot, which is really good. If you want to attach elastic while serging, you can sometimes, on some presser foots, they do have a little bit of slot, so you can use a narrow piece of elastic for that. But the one that is dedicated to stitching elastic has a tool where you can regulate the tension. So you can, by making adjusting a screw, you can make the elastic pull together, so you can create gathers and then you release the screw and you will have a straight even stitch. So that's one of the things. If your regular presser foot doesn't really support elastic and has a slot for attaching it, and if you sew a lot of knits, perhaps swimwear, underwear, then I would definitely say that getting an elastic presser foot would be probably my first buy. I have, as I said, a blind hem presser foot. For this one, I have not tried it. I used it for my last Serger, and as I said, the result was definitely fine, but not as good as I had hoped. And binding. I said the wrong word. Sorry, I meant piping. You know, when you have this narrow detail on garments. There is also a presser foot with that, which I'm dying to experiment with, especially adding binding on knits. So that looks like a really neat feature. There's also someone that can attach pearls, I think, yeah. Super weird. I have not tried that one. So that can also be something to check out if you're considering buying a Serger, to look at what accessory that comes with it. If there's some things that you will find useful, you might opt for that model as well that has those extra attachments. And Linda has an old Sears Kenmore Serger. Sounds like a jackhammer while sewing, and I use it exclusively for roll hem. Well, that is actually a really good setup. When I took the class for this machine and she showed me how to do the roll hem, the teacher told me that she had a client that have bought also a Serger just for the roll hem, so she doesn't mess with those settings, and then she has a second Serger for the rest. I thought that was a bit frivolous, but I kind of like the idea, because experiment with the settings, that can be quite cumbersome sometimes. And Cecilia said, I got the extra feet as well, but I'm a bit scared to use them. Well, I feel you. I'm definitely something I have not ventured into yet myself. And well, says Clemens, I would love to see tutorials using your different feet. Well, once I get more familiar with the ones that I'm not familiar with right now, like the one with the stitches pearls or beading, I think it's called, then I can do a tutorial, but that will probably take a little while until I feel confident enough to share my knowledge about those. And Sandra Engstrand, that sounds like a Swedish sounding name, but maybe I should say Sandra Engstrand. Hello from Nashville. And also, if you come late to the live stream, there will be YouTube will automatically publish the video afterwards. It might take a little while, but it will show up after a little bit. And if you want to watch my live streams, the schedule is as following. The last Sunday of each month I do a live stream. At least that's what I'm planning to do. Of course, sometimes lives get in the way, but I do. That's my usual schedule, and I will tell in advance on the blog, on my Instagram, which is Last Stitch, and of course also on my Facebook page, and links to all the social media stuff you will find in an About tab or someplace on YouTube as well. But if you head over to my blog, thelaststitch.com, you can find all the other social media channels that I have, and I try to update all of those to tell when the next live stream is on and what the topic is about. And also, if you at the live stream page, I think you can hit notification, and then often but not always YouTube will tell you when the next live stream is on. It doesn't work all the time, because apparently YouTube doesn't want to spam people, which is totally understandable. And we have some from South Carolina as well here. And Viv Mom says, did you make your shirt? Can we know the pattern? Thank you very much. Yeah, it's a t-shirt pattern that I drafted myself, and the fabric is from a local fabric vendor here in Göteborg where I live, called Yvonne, and she has a shop called Tygaffären, and I think you can still buy this fabric. So it's actually sewing themed. It's a super nice cotton lycra jersey, and I highly recommend this one. And yes, I drafted the pattern myself because I struggled to find a t-shirt that fit me the way I wanted it, so I'm really happy about this one. It's one of my favorite. I reach for it every time. It makes me feel so comfortable, and because it's sewing theme, it's nice to wear also when I'm sewing. And we have people from Madrid, and Natalie says, excellent, I missed a lot of it. This is really beneficial. Thank you for posting this as. Thank you so much for tuning in. And Absolutely Fabulous says, I'm late to the party but looking forward from the replay. Hi from England. And we also have Magdalena says, I'm going to repeat my Spanish. Hola desde Madrid, España. Sorry, I studied Spanish for 3 years in high school, but I wasn't very good at it. Sorry. Anyways, that was all for me today. As I said, you can head over to my blog, thelostlist.com, where I have done several tutorials on Sergers and also review several books that pertains to Sergers. And well, I'm super happy that so many of you tuned in. It's so fun to do these live chats. It gives me a lot of energy, even though it's late at night here now and it's time to go to bed. But I do love the community and it's so fun to chat with you like this. It makes me feel like we're almost in the same room. And well, that was all for me now. And stitch safe, and I'll see you in a month with another live stream. And of course, there will be new videos every Sunday as usual, because that's my regular schedule. But the live stream is the last Sunday each month. Bye bye!